Scott Moe says that there needs to be increased cooperation with China. A news release that you guys had issued yesterday said that there needs to be a better working relationship on trade with China. That's specifically what the premiers were calling on the Prime Minister to do. So help me reconcile those two things. Is China the enemy, or do we work with China?
Premier Doug Ford didn't hold back. In the middle of one of the most uncertain trade climates in North American history, Ontario's premier stood before reporters and said the quiet part out loud: if Trump's tariffs continue, Canada may look east to China. This wasn't just a warning, it was a signal, a shift. One of Canada's most powerful provincial leaders openly floated the idea of deepening trade with Beijing, not Washington. And for the US, that could mean more than just a lost customer. It could mean a long-term strategic blow. So what happens if Canada actually pivots to China? Let's break it down. Since returning to the White House, President Trump has made tariffs the centerpiece of his trade agenda once again. His administration argues this is about fairness, making sure America isn't taken advantage of. But for Canada, these policies haven't brought clarity. They've brought volatility. Steel, aluminum, autos, and even softwood lumber have been hit. And now, a sweeping 35% tariff looms over all non-compliant Canadian goods starting August 1st. For business leaders across North America, this isn't a negotiation tactic. It's a threat that keeps shifting, and it's reshaping the foundation of what used to be the world's most stable trade partnership.
You know what Churchill said, our enemy of our enemy is our friend, and as long as China plays fair and doesn't undercut our markets, be it the auto sector or any sector, I have no problem dealing with them.
In response, Canada hasn't shouted, it's acted. Ottawa has quietly escalated its own tariffs on American steel and aluminum, matching the US increases. But more importantly, Canada is shifting focus. While there's still strong trade with the US, provincial leaders are building escape routes, pipelines, new export lanes, and diversified partnerships. That includes China. Ontario alone conducts over $43 billion in two-way trade with China, according to provincial figures. Imports dominate that number, but Ford is clear. If the US continues to act unpredictably, Canada will work with whoever plays fair, and that includes China. Even as Ford emphasizes protecting Canada's auto sector from Chinese EVs, his message is unmistakable. Canada is no longer beholden to the United States. We've already seen the signs. Canadian brewers are sourcing aluminum cans from China, not the US, due to skyrocketing prices from Trump's tariffs. RBC reports that as of June 2025, nearly 90% of Canadian exports entering the US are now fully USMCA compliant. A defensive move, proving Canadian businesses are adjusting supply chains to navigate around American uncertainty.
We buy about $349 billion of products. So Japan and the rest of the countries around the world have quite a bit to catch up to what we purchase off the US.
If Canada's pivot becomes permanent, the US will feel it in ways that go far beyond headlines. In 2024, Canada purchased $349 billion worth of American goods, more than Japan, Germany, and the UK combined. Losing even a portion of that trade to China would hit US manufacturers hard. Sectors like autos, machinery, agriculture, and energy rely on stable cross-border flows. If Canadian buyers shift orders to Chinese suppliers, the pain will be domestic, felt in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And it's not just about goods. Strategically, China has long sought to expand its influence in the Western Hemisphere. A deeper trade relationship with Canada would give Beijing more leverage in North America, something Washington has tried to avoid for decades. In trying to punish Canada, Trump may be pushing it into China's arms. Trump promised to win better trade deals. But tariffs have delivered something else: hesitation, retaliation, and uncertainty. Instead of pulling Canada closer, the White House is driving a wedge. A country that once stood as America's closest economic ally is now exploring other options, because it feels like it has to. Trump's tariffs were designed to protect American workers. But if those policies fracture trade relationships and push partners toward rival powers, then the damage may run far deeper than economic losses. In this new trade world, isolation isn't strength, it's a liability. And for the US, The question isn't whether tariffs backfire. It's how long we're willing to pretend they didn't.
The trade war between Canada and the United States causing economic uncertainty. Canadian leaders are looking to Asia and Europe for reliable trade partners.
European negotiators say trade between the U.S. and EU could be effectively cut off if Trump goes ahead with a 30% tariff that he threatened over the weekend.
America's global influence was built not just on military power, but on long-standing partnerships, especially in trade. Today, that foundation is starting to break. If President Trump continues to raise tariffs on key allies, the United States risks more than short-term retaliation. It could lose its central role in the global economy. Canada is shifting its trade strategy. The European Union is preparing to strike back. And together, these moves are showing that the world may be ready to move on without U.S. leadership.
The deals are made. There are no deals to make. They would like to do a different kind of a deal, and we're always open to talk. We are open to talk, including to Europe. If in fact they're coming over, they'd like to talk.
President Trump believes that high tariffs will force other countries to accept better trade terms. But if those countries decide to stop relying on the U.S. altogether, the result could be long-term damage. When global supply chains adjust, the changes are not easily reversed. Companies may move production away from North America. Trade flows may shift permanently. Key U.S. industries, like finance, pharmaceuticals, and technology, could face new restrictions and rising costs in foreign markets. And once trading partners begin to rely less on U.S. systems, including the dollar and American tech platforms, the U.S. risks being left out of decisions that shape the global economy. The European Union is treating Trump's tariffs not just as an economic threat, but as a strategic rupture. Officials in Brussels say a 30% tariff on EU goods could effectively wipe out transatlantic trade. According to the European Commission, the U.S. imports more than $600 billion annually from the EU, while exporting only $370 billion. At first, the EU held back, pausing a $25 billion countermeasure package to allow for dialogue. But they've already prepared a larger $72 billion retaliation if talks collapse. Their strategy is twofold: de-escalate if possible, but punish if necessary. What's notable isn't just the scope of the response. It's the areas being targeted, U.S. services like finance and tech, where retaliation would hurt most.
Last month, you look at the data from Statistics Canada, which looks at the month of May, and we saw the highest amount of merchandise exports to non-U.S. countries since at least 2021.
Canada's response has been quieter, but no less consequential. After Trump's tariff announcement, exports to the U.S. dropped sharply. In May 2025, Statistics Canada reported just $41 billion in exports to the U.S., a 25% decline from January. Meanwhile, exports to non-U.S. countries rose to $19 billion, the highest since 2021. Canada is redirecting gold to the UK, oil to Singapore, pharmaceuticals to Italy. More than that, Canada is reopening dialogue with India, despite political tension. For Alberta and Saskatchewan, accessing India's pulse crop market is critical. This isn't just diversification, it's a structural shift. Prime Minister Mark Carney isn't threatening countermeasures. He's methodically building an economy that no longer depends on the U.S., a move supported by both policy and public sentiment. Trump's strategy is clear. He believes pressure forces deals. But pressure without flexibility can create fractures. The EU isn't folding, Canada isn't waiting. And if Trump continues down this path, America may win a few concessions, but lose the cohesion that once made it powerful. In trying to maximize leverage, Washington could undermine its own role in global leadership. Allies won't leave in anger. They'll simply move on, with new partners, new trade routes, and a future that no longer revolves around the U.S. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. Trump's tariff play may feel strong in the short term, but the long game is different. And as Canada restructures and Europe prepares its counterpunch, one reality grows clearer. The world won't wait for America to lead. Not if it keeps pushing them away.
Today, 30%, that is the amount of a new tariff President Trump just announced on goods from the European Union and Mexico starting August 1st.
We have always been very clear that we prefer a negotiated solution. This remains the case, and we will use the time that we have now till the 1st of August.
It began with a letter, first to Canada, then to the European Union, and just days later, to Mexico. Each one signed by President Donald Trump. Each one carrying the same message. Starting August 1st, the United States would impose a 30% tariff on goods from its closest trading partners, unless they struck a new deal on Trump's terms. These weren't enemies. These were allies, longtime allies. And the timing was even more startling. The threats came while formal negotiations were still underway. The result? A diplomatic shockwave rippling across Ottawa, Brussels, and Mexico City.
That all the efforts that the European Commission has made to try to accommodate, try to negotiate a deal, meant nothing for Trump.
This is not the first time Trump has used tariffs as leverage. But this round felt different. The strategy was announced weeks earlier, a new series of reciprocal tariffs, followed by a 90-day pause to allow countries to negotiate. That pause expired this month, and Trump didn't wait. Instead, he began sending out personalized tariff notices, 30% across the board, starting with Canada in early July, and then to the EU and Mexico on July 12th. The message was clear: agree to new trade terms by August 1st, or face higher costs. The tariffs would hit every corner of commerce: cars, electronics, food, medicine. Inside the White House, officials described this as a reset. One economic advisor admitted the president was frustrated by slow progress. With the original 90 deals in 90 days promise slipping, Trump turned to pressure tactics. But this was no ordinary pressure. These were public threats, delivered mid-negotiation, targeting countries that had historically built supply chains with the U.S., not against it.
Well, it shows that Donald Trump thinks he can maybe get a deal by threatening to escalate. But I have to think it will backfire.
The first to respond was Canada. Prime Minister Mark Carney had already set a July 21st target to complete talks with the U.S. But after the tariff letter arrived, he extended that deadline to August 1st, matching Trump's. Rather than retaliate immediately, Canada held firm. Government officials emphasized continued dialogue, even as they warned they would protect workers in key sectors: steel, autos, and especially copper, which had already faced a 50% tariff. In Europe, the reaction was similar. EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen confirmed that Brussels would continue talks until the deadline, but she also made it clear the EU was fully prepared to impose countermeasures if needed. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz echoed that view, warning that failure to reach a deal could have serious consequences. According to ING chief economist Carsten Brzezinski, if the 30% tariff is enacted, it could shave off 0.4 percentage points from Eurozone GDP, bringing 2025 growth dangerously close to zero. Mexico's response followed the same tone. Officials called the tariff unfair, but reaffirmed their commitment to negotiations.
On track, since the very beginning, we have worked and now are ready to respond with countermeasures.
And the Mexican officials conveyed that 30% tariff marked, quote, unfair treatment, and that they did not agree.
We are not alone in this world. We need to be closer to our allies.
What's happening now goes beyond trade numbers or tariff rates. It's about trust. For decades, America's closest partners assumed that policy differences would be handled behind closed doors, not through public threats. Now, those same partners are being forced to choose between accepting last-minute demands or risking economic punishment. Canada has spent years integrating its economy with the U.S., from auto manufacturing in Ontario to copper refining in Quebec. The EU built transatlantic agreements on the idea of stable, rules-based cooperation. And Mexico, long a pillar of the USMCA framework, is suddenly being treated like a problem, not a partner. What Trump sees as hard bargaining, many allies are now viewing as betrayal. With the clock ticking to August 1st, one thing is clear: Trump isn't backing down. But neither are America's allies. Canada is holding the line. The EU is preparing its defense. and Mexico is still at the table. Whether this strategy leads to new deals or a deeper rift will be revealed soon. But one thing is certain. These letters didn't just threaten tariffs. They threatened relationships. And some of those may be harder to repair than any trade deficit.
U.S. President Donald Trump is threatening even higher tariffs on Canada. News that goods that comply with the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade deal will be exempt. New today, Carney says he will convene his cabinet on Tuesday to discuss Canada's response, and he'll be joining the premiers for their annual summer gathering on July 22nd to discuss this.
This wasn't how the deal was supposed to end. Just days away from what was meant to be the final phase of negotiations between the U.S. and Canada, the entire process took a sharp turn. Not with a handshake, but with a new threat. Washington's message was clear: take the offer or face the consequences. And while many expected Canada to blink, Ottawa chose a different path. It didn't walk away, but it didn't fold either. Instead, Prime Minister Mark Carney quietly extended the negotiation deadline to August 1st and began gathering his cabinet and provincial leaders behind closed doors. Because beneath the headlines, Canada is playing for time, and more importantly, it still has leverage. Trump didn't invent trade brinkmanship, but he's turned it into performance art. With each new phase of negotiation, he raises the stakes. Not through formal channels, but through surprise letters, volatile statements, and moving deadlines. It's a strategy designed to keep his counterparts off balance and his domestic base fired up. In just 3 weeks, the end date for Canada's trade talks has shifted from July 16th to the 21st and now August 1st. Behind the scenes, officials in Ottawa believe this is part of a calculated tactic. The goal? Force Canada to concede more. On supply management, on pharmaceuticals, on long-standing trade protections without having to offer much in return. Trump's team sees unpredictability as strength. It creates pressure, it creates confusion, and it creates urgency. But there's a catch. Overuse of the tactic risks making it predictable and less effective. When the 35% tariff threat hit, markets barely flinched. The Toronto Stock Exchange slipped just 0.22%, a sign that fatigue is setting in. And fatigue, in this case, may be Canada's quiet advantage. That doesn't mean things are easy in Ottawa. Prime Minister Mark Carney entered office promising a more stable, strategic approach to Washington. But since then, he's had to watch his government drop its digital services tax, absorb copper tariffs, and freeze steel retaliation, all just to keep talks alive. At home, expectations are rising, and time is running out. There's also one immovable object in the room: supply management. Canada's dairy and poultry markets remain tightly controlled and protected. A new Canadian law, passed earlier this year, prohibits any future trade deal from expanding access to that system. It's politically popular, but inflexible. And Trump has repeatedly singled it out as a sticking point. If Canada won't touch it, and the US won't drop it, that leaves very little room to maneuver. Still, Canada isn't powerless. First, there's USMCA, the trade deal still in effect. Goods that meet its rules of origin are exempt from Trump's new tariff. It's a legal firewall that limits just how far the White House can go. Second, internal unity is strengthening. Alberta and Ontario have signed interprovincial trade agreements. Nova Scotia is coordinating with Ottawa on industrial strategy. These aren't headline moves, but they reduce fragmentation and improve resilience. Third, Canada is diversifying. Exports to the EU and UK are growing. ASEAN outreach is expanding. In short, the US is no longer the only game in town. And fourth, there's fatigue. Global markets are showing signs that Trump's tariff threats no longer hold the shock value they once did. As CBC noted, the fear is real, but the surprise is gone.
I just can't see a deal being done, a real trade agreement being done by August 1st with the Americans. I think what we'll have in a few weeks is nothing more than a handshake. But a handshake deal is, I guess, worth what you might think with Mr. Trump.
So, is this checkmate? Not yet. What Canada needs now is clarity. Not necessarily a perfect deal, but a durable one. One that doesn't depend on Twitter posts or late-night letters. the likely outcome is a handshake deal, something symbolic, flexible, and light on detail. Enough for Trump to declare victory, and enough for Carney to avoid collapse, because in this moment, stability may be the biggest win anyone can hope for. And for Canada, surviving the storm might just be its greatest leverage yet.
Canada is not open to us. They need to open their market. Unless they're willing to open their market, they're going to pay a tariff.
Of Canada's economy. Of course, the federal government is getting down to the wire in trade negotiations with the U.S.
And softwood may actually be one of those opportunities for us to strike an early deal with the Americans.
Trade talks between Canada and the United States have entered their most critical stage yet. With President Trump's August 1st deadline fast approaching, U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick made it clear, unless Canada opens its market, tariffs will hit. But Ottawa isn't folding. Prime Minister Mark Carney is now meeting with U.S. senators and provincial premiers to find a narrow path forward. A full rollback of tariffs is no longer expected. Instead, Canada is pushing for a limited sector-based deal, one that avoids broad economic damage and restores predictability, even if some tariffs remain.
They want to ensure that they're able to provide high-quality, low-cost building materials for Americans. Also, it's a recognition that in this reality that we're in with this president, we've got to put some things on the table to have conversation.
In the midst of this, one old issue is taking on new significance: softwood lumber. British Columbia has faced U.S. duties on softwood for years. But now, for the first time, Canadian officials, including Premier David Eby, are publicly signaling openness to export quotas as part of a deal. This marks a shift. Quotas were previously off the table, but with over $7 billion in softwood tariffs currently held in escrow and trade talks hanging by a thread, Canadian lumber is being positioned as a strategic bargaining chip, not just a casualty of U.S. protectionism. Why now? Because softwood could offer a rare, quick win. It's a sector with high visibility, cross-border interdependence, and enough political weight on both sides to create leverage, without touching more sensitive industries like dairy or autos.
Look, we got to be honest with ourselves as Canadians, and I think the Carney government has done a good job at this in its sort of early days. This is Trump's strategy, right? Exactly what you just described. That's what his sort of MO has been really in Trump 2.0 administration.
But the game Canada is playing is anything but straightforward. Trump's trade strategy has been deliberately chaotic, shifting deadlines, unclear demands, and threats of full renegotiation of USMCA in 2026. His pattern of destabilization forces other governments to react, not plan. Former New Brunswick Premier Brian Gallant, who once sat at the Premier's table, described Trump's approach as engineered confusion. And Canada, this time, is refusing to be baited. Carney's government isn't matching chaos with chaos. It's choosing discipline, listening to provinces, aligning federal priorities, and pursuing options outside the North American orbit. Canada's response is quiet but coordinated. Ontario defends its auto sector. British Columbia brings softwood to the table. Quebec wants time-bound clarity. Despite differences, premiers are presenting a united front. At the national level, Canada is reinforcing its foundation. Bill C-5 aims to break internal trade barriers. The major projects. Bill prioritizes infrastructure, energy, and mining, especially with Indigenous partnership. Externally, Canada is expanding its reach. From stronger ties with Mexico and the EU to renewed talks with G7 allies, the message is clear. Canada won't rely solely on Washington. Trump may still push forward with tariffs, but the cost is starting to show, not just for Canada, but for the U.S. as well. Softwood lumber duties have already raised construction costs across the U.S., particularly in housing markets dependent on Canadian imports. American lawmakers are under pressure. A bipartisan delegation of senators is now in Ottawa, not to threaten, but to preserve economic stability. And the longer the standoff continues, the more Canadian industries accelerate their pivot away from U.S. dependency. That's the paradox. The harder Trump pushes, the more self-reliant and strategic Canada becomes. This isn't just a trade dispute, it's a stress test for policy, diplomacy, and national cohesion. Softwood lumber might not look like much, but in this moment, it represents something bigger: the ability of a country to hold its ground, make smart concessions, and defend its sovereignty without shouting. Trump's tariffs may yet land, but if they do, the blowback won't just be felt in Ottawa. It'll echo across American construction sites, congressional offices, and investor portfolios. And in the end, it may be Canada's quiet resolve, not Washington's volume, that shapes the deal.